Wow. Okay. So we're going to talk about Harriet Chase Newell tonight. I named this one Harriet Chase Newell, the woman behind the books, because this stack of books here that you see is a stack of books that we use all the time here at the good old DPL. And it's Harriet's books. So Harriet Chase Newell wrote 5 books on house histories in Derry, and she wrote a memoir called In Retrospect, and she also wrote one called Through the Years with Central Congregational Church. So she is one of those resources that I go to all the time. When someone comes in looking for information on their Derry house, I look at the historic house survey, I identify the house in Harriet's book, and I go and I read about it there. And then I can direct them to things like New Hampshire deeds or old maps and that sort of thing. But it's literally one of our first stops. So when I say it's a invaluable resource, I'm not joking around. So finding out a little bit about Harriet was a lot of fun, because I was like, okay, who's the woman behind the books? I want to know. I didn't know. And I found out quite a good deal. Last time we all met, we were talking about research. So I just wanted to touch on research really quickly, and we'll kind of do this here and there throughout the presentation, because, you know, this is genealogy group and we talk about how to find things. One of our main things we talked about last time was having a goal and then making a plan and then executing the plan. So my research approach I thought about for Harriet, and it was to look at census records, vital records, will and probate records, obviously the Derry news, because I knew I was going to find a ton of information in there about her and her family, and that's true. House history books, obviously most of that had to do with her own house history books. New Hampshire deeds I looked at, but honestly, when I put her name into the New Hampshire deeds registry page, so many hits came back, and I just didn't have time. I'm not going to be able to have time to go through that kind of thing with you all, but if you're interested in that, let me know and we'll go back to it. Other things in the New Hampshire room, like the lateral files, Harriet's books, and her other writing. She has a fun little folk tale that she also wrote down, which I'm gonna read a little bit of it to you. And then I also had on my list to talk to Rick, because he had contacted me midweek and said, hey, I want to talk to you about Hattie. So that was my approach. I did not get everything. There is so much on Harriet that it would be impossible. But I'm hoping that I'm going to cover enough to give you an idea of who she was. And she was a very interesting person. So starting out with the early years, the gift of Harriet's books is that because she wrote in retrospect, we do have some pictures and also some of her words, which I think is really special. I know in the past in this group, we've talked about, oh, should I write my story or not? You know, will people care? I think you should. I think you should, and I think you shouldn't worry about it being academic. Harriet says, you know, her books are anecdotal and they're stories, and they're not strictly academic, and that's what I love about them. They're accessible, they're interesting. They just have a different tone. And if you were to give that to your descendant, or if you were to receive that from an ancestor, I mean, think about that kind of gift. That's awesome. So you'll see a little bit from In Retrospect, which is Harriet's memoir, and then genealogical papers. So here we have Harriet Chase Newell. She was born Harriet Louise Chase on 22 January 1881 to Benjamin Chase and Harriet D. Chase, maiden name Fuller, and she was their one and only child. So here she is, about 5 years old. And right here is her birth record from the New Hampshire Vital Records page. And we always talk about, you know, go way beyond the index, look at the actual, you know, record, because you're going to find so much more about someone. So here we see it says Hattie L. Chase, her birth date, Derry, her sex and color, and then that she was the first child. And then it also gives us information about the parents. So we see Benjamin Chase Jr. is listed here from Auburn, and he was a manufacturer. Now, you can't always trust that every single thing on a birth record is true, especially because this one was something that would have been copied from the town records and sent to the state, but it's a place to start. And then you can start correlating pieces of information. So let's look a little bit at Harriet's parents. You know, she was the daughter of Benjamin Chase and Harriet Fuller. Who are these people? So here's Benjamin Chase, and you know, here's a picture of him slightly younger, a little bit older. Both of those pictures are from Harriet's book. He was a machinist, and as you saw in the previous document that said manufacturer, it said ribbon reed factory in some newspaper articles, and then it said ribbon harness in others. This was a man who made stuff. He understood how things went together. And you can see that in this little, I loved this little one I came upon in the Derry News. It's from, what year do we have here? 1893. Check it out. The World's Fair Entertainment. Do not fail to hear the World's Fair Entertainment to be given under the direction of the YPSOF, I think that says, in Association Hall. And it tells you who's going to be there, who's in charge of what, the midway, music, art buildings, state buildings. And then down here, and you see Ferris Wheel and Machinery Hall, Benjamin Chase. So, you know, he could put things together. He was in charge of that whole hall. I'm sure he made things for it. This one cracked me up because in 1884, it wasn't about machinery. It was about a flower. And I just thought that was special. I was like, oh, look at this. Here's Benjamin Chase written up in the Derry News. Benjamin Chase Jr. has a beautiful night blooming cereus in flower last Saturday night. Many of his neighbors paid it a visit. It's just a funny side note. We're going to look at the Benjamin Chase Mill, which I know you guys will recognize the most current iteration of it. But I also found this article about when they were putting together a canal. This was 1900. So it says big engineering scheme being prosecuted by Benjamin Chase to provide better water power. So he was making a canal to run from, I think it was Beaver Brook over to his mill. It says the scheme includes the digging of a canal from Meadow Pond to his mill, a distance of over 1,000 feet. The canal will convey water from the meadow to the new penstock and water wheel, which he put in last year. So he was always thinking about ways to make the mill better, run better. He definitely was a very capable and interesting person. A couple things about the mill. So here's the original Benjamin Chase Mill. This was a picture that Rick sent me. In retrospect, you see the memory of Harriet is one of the first things she says in the book is my earliest recollection is of June 1883 when Papa's shop was burned. I was not quite 2.5. Mama and I and Mrs. Howe had driven to Auburn to spend the day. Coming home, they saw smoke, but it was not until they reached the top of Tilton Hill above the village on the turnpike that they determined it was the shop. And here, if we look in the Derry News for that same time period, we can see coverage of the destructive fire. So it says, and I know it's small, so I'll just read a little bit of it to you to give you an idea of what's going on. It says, shortly after 6 o'clock Monday afternoon, the drying room of the ribbon harness shaft manufactory of Benjamin Chase Jr., situated on Beaver Brook, opposite the sawmill. This village was discovered to be on fire by Mr. W.D. Kincaid, who immediately gave an alarm. But before assistance could be rendered, the whole interior of this building was a mass of seething, roaring flames, before which all retreated. Within a very few minutes, scores of men and boys were at hand, gallantly endeavoring to stay the flames, which soon involved the building in the rear of the dry house and threatened the destruction of the sawmill and several dwellings adjacent. The small brown house belonging to the Nesmith estate and tenanted by the families of Mr. Powell and Mr. O'Neill was repeatedly on fire, and it was only by the most strenuous efforts that it was finally saved from a total destruction. So it's, you know, this was huge. This was a huge fire. Not these burned regularly, but, you know, it seemed like there was a horrible fire every week. In the destruction of the old shop, so-called, one of the towers, part of being shafting and wire rope used to run the news press, because they shared the building, was destroyed. So Mr. Bartlett's Derry newsroom as well. Mr. Chase's losses will amount to over $10,000. And as there was no insurance on building or stock, the loss is total and a heavy one. So, you know, a couple of setbacks here, and Harriet's first memory, which I think is interesting. Now the second mill, because I don't want to spend too much time on her parents. There's so much to say about Harriet. Just to give you a glimpse of it, this was a rebuilding of the mill, and then it as a full mill. And then we also have the third mill, which I think you guys will recognize. Do you guys recognize that? Let me see if I can see. Yeah. So when you go and, you know, go around the roundabout and you're headed to Chester, you go up on the right-hand side there, it's the Benjamin Chase Mill condos. And right there is the old mill, and it's the same building. See right here, you've got that square piece. So you can drive by it and know that that's the Benjamin Chase Mill. Now, Benjamin Chase is the dad, of course, and then there's Harriet Fuller. Occasionally, in retrospect, Harriet would refer to Harriet Fuller as Hattie. She also occasionally referred to herself as Hattie. So, I kind of go in between. Harriet was involved in organizations, extremely competent, extremely charitable. There's a lot that she did that wasn't written down as much, but this gives you a little bit of an idea. She was a regular member of the Molly Reed chapter. That's the Daughters of the American Revolution. It says here, regular meeting greatly enjoyed at the home of Mrs. Benjamin Chase. So not only was she, part of the chapter, she's holding the meetings. So that's, a big thing. And then there was also, we can zoom out of this. Just little notes that made you realize that she was often put in charge of things. And I've referred to, so she was part of, the Ladies Benevolent Society. She was president of it twice, according to in retrospect. And in here, you can see they were raising money, and they had to meet a deficit. There was a debt that was canceled, and it was due to Harriet's work that it was canceled. So down toward the bottom, and I won't read you the full article, but it said how the money was raised and the debt discharge was given in a pleasing manner by Mrs. Benjamin Chase. She stated that the afternoon before the supper, there were $85 still due on the debt. She went around and solicited of a few friends, and before 6 o'clock had secured enough to cancel the debt and had left a comfortable balance, so that the net proceeds from the supper added to it, and also a gift of $25 gave them some $90 to be applied. So she was, in charge of finances. She went around out of her way to make sure that everything was okay with the money for the Ladies Benevolent Society. And she was also head of the board of directors for the Central Congregational Church from 1901 to her death in 1912. So she was a very busy woman. And this may also look familiar to you. So here's the Chase Newell Homestead, 16 Crescent Street. Does that look familiar to anybody? Let me zoom in. It's near the Methodist Church. This is what it looks like approximately today. This isn't like today's picture, but it was a satellite, thanks to Google, a satellite image of it. And on our left here, we have an image from Rick Holmes. Obviously, look at the, the yard. It doesn't look exactly the same with that big pasture across the way. But in this picture, if you look closely, you can see Harriet and her mother on the steps and Benjamin Chase standing right here walking up the walk. So that's a really interesting shot. And what a beautiful house. So that's where, Harriet grew up. Big house, single child. She was a lucky kid, I think. She was a good student. Here's a picture of Harriet in 1899. This is from her memoir. She says, when we in the school districts were ready to enter the local academy, it was necessary to take examinations. I was a good scholar, especially in arithmetic. Some people thought later that she wasn't good at math, but listen to this. She says, but I was so nerved up at the ordeal that I did not do very well, definitely flunking the test in arithmetic, and was advised that I should take the preparatory classwork. That made 5 years instead of 4 to look forward to. And unfortunately, I lost another year by having a bad case of measles. So it extended her schooling a little bit. That was when she was headed to Pinkerton Academy. Before that, she went to the district school. And just to give you a little taste of what she was good at, she said spelling was something I took to like a duck to water, and I usually could spell down the room. And that doesn't surprise me because her books are very readable. And then she went to Pinkerton for a little while. And then she went to Abbot Academy in North Andover for 2 years. And she said of Abbot Academy, and here's a picture of one of the buildings there. She said, Miss Bacon was my favorite. I think she had the Latin classes and sometimes really laughed out loud. It was a joy to know her. And I was especially happy because she said I had the best preparation of any pupil she ever had. Now, she kind of likes that boisterousness of Miss Bacon, it sounds like. And at first you might think, okay, Harriet also is gregarious, where when you read her writing, she's talkative and funny, and she's frank. And maybe she's drawn to Miss Bacon because of that. But actually, she talks a bit about how she was very shy as a child, as a youth, and sometimes she felt nervous. And just like with that math test, especially in academics, she'd get nerved up. But she seemed to have grown out of that a little bit later, because she certainly made her voice heard, I think, through time. On this was in retrospect, and it was a picture of Harriet and Catherine Kay. And I liked finding that because in the Derry News of 1900, there's a notice, I think, of Catherine Kay right here. It says, Wednesday evening of this week, Mrs. Benjamin Chase gave a dinner in honor of her daughter, Miss Harriet Chase, and Miss Catherine King of Abbot Academy. During the evening, the guests were very pleasantly entertained with vocal and instrumental music by Mrs. Warner. The guests included Mrs. Warner, Wheeler, Chase, Pitnam, Bonnie, and Melvin. So this is the kind of thing you can correlate, right? When you have so much information on somebody, you say, okay, Catherine King from Abbot Academy, she was in Derry. She was at a party here in Derry at the Homestead, and everything starts to come together. So that's a lot of fun. And then there were just a couple of pictures of travels and notices in the Derry News. Again, when I say news is the best time capsule, I'm not joking around. You find things in there that you never would have thought anybody wrote down, but Julie Huss writing it all down. So here we have a picture from, in retrospect, of the redwood tree in California. And sure enough, what do we find in the Derry News? Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Chase and daughter Miss Harriet Chase returned the first of this week from an extended trip to California. They report a very pleasant and most enjoyable trip. It looks like it. And then down here, just one more trip was mentioned when she was younger. Mrs. Benjamin Chase and daughter, Miss Harriet Chase, have returned from a very pleasant trip to Washington. So she got out there a little bit and traveled about. I mean, we talk about Elsie Gaskin, who was really out and about. We previously talked about Elsie. Harriet didn't seem to travel quite as much as Elsie, but Harriet also had many children. So, and Elsie had none. So maybe that was part of why. Is everybody still with me? You guys good? Okay. All right. So here we have Harriet married Charles Newell on 22 January 1907. Let's just look at this like it's a scrapbook. So here we have them on their wedding day. Beautiful dress, wonderful suit. We also have a record of the marriage. It's not giving us tons of new information, but it's always good to look at. So it's Charles Edward Newell, Harriet Louise Chase, Derry. He was 31, she was 25. He was a physician, so that's good to know. And he was from Goffstown. So let's look at this wedding announcement. If you look in the Derry News, you see this brilliant wedding ceremony notice. It says a brilliant wedding ceremony was performed at the home of the bride's parents. So again, think of that lovely home with that huge yard, and that's where the wedding took place. Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Chase, Derry Village, where their only child, Mrs. Harriet Louise Chase, and Dr. Charles Edward Newell of Bedford were united in marriage in the presence of relatives and a few invited friends. The beautiful ceremony was performed by Reverend Charles Loveland Marion, pastor of the Central Congregational Church. No surprise there. The house presented a veritable bower of cut flowers, ferns, and furs. The ceremony took place before a novel arrangement of flowers in green with white ribbon representing a fence, with large bouquets of flowers at each side upon the miniature posts. And the best man was Dr. That's Howard Newell. It says Newell, but it should be Newell, brother of the groom. It tells about the different attendants and more about the dresses and the trimmings. I mean, this is always in the old newspapers, how much they would say about a wedding. It just was like being there. You're going to hear about, she was in, I think it tells what kind of silk gown. She was attired in a gown of white Liberty silk. It's lovely. So let's look at Charles here, where he was a physician. This is a picture of Charles and his buggy. Apparently, according to Rick Holmes, he'd use this for house calls in the winter. So it's hard to get around, right? So he'd go from house to house with this great rig. You can see it's kind of half truck, half sleigh. And in here in the background is the homestead. He's not at somebody's house. He's just posing out in front of the house at the moment in this one. And then we also have a familiar site, I think probably to most of you. So before they lived over at the Homestead, they lived first in Bedford. And then when they were back in Derry, right next door to where I'm looking at the building right now at the window, the Masons building. It was not always the Masons building, right? Before it was the Masons building, it was the Boyd Homestead, and then it was the Newells. And it had the physician's office, and then Harriet and Charles lived there as well. And you can see, if you look closely at the front of the building, right? Look at the top here. And then even the side over here, you can see that on the Masonic Lodge even today. And here's the side. You can just see that they added pillars around. And so they lived there for a short period of time, relatively speaking. She lived in Derry her whole life. So relatively, well, except for when they were in Bedford, but that was so small. We're claiming her as a Derry resident, lifelong Derry resident, for a short period of time comparatively. And so you can see Harriet's house when you go by. Just take a look at the Masons building and know that she lived there as well. All right, children, she had 7. Harriet had 7 children. And if you look at the census record, this is where it gets fun to start cross-correlating, right? We look at the 1920, I have the 1920 census record here, and I have a picture of her children from in retrospect up here. Now, 1920 census does not include Ruth Lee. So I'm going to tell you right here, here's a picture of Ruth Lee, and Ruth Lee's in our audience tonight. And I'm hoping we can, you know, if Ruth Lee will chime in at the end if I've made any errors. But I think we can identify the other children based on the census. So we have in her household Charles and Harriet. You know that. The eldest son is Henry, or is that Harry? Sorry, is that Harry or Henry? I think it says Henry, but correct me later, Ruth Lee. That's Henry or Harry. I'm going to go with that being the oldest, right?
It's Henry.
It's Henry, thank you. And then Benjamin, and we'll see if I get this right. So then Benjamin, I'm going to say is here. Edward, here. Louise, here. Dorothy, right here. And Prescott, the youngest boy. And then here's Ruth Lee. So those were those were Harriet's 7 children. And she got married in 1907. So 1920, she'd had 6 of them. That's pretty fast, right? I mean, that's a lot of work right there. And this was a wonderful little article in the Derry News, 1908. And I believe this to be true based on the retrospect memoir as well. It is said that Henry Chase Newell, the child of Dr. Charles E. and Harriet Chase Newell, was very recently christened at the Central Church, and the water used was taken from a bottle of water brought from the River Jordan in Holy Land by the grandparents and an excursion made by them through that interesting country. So the grandparents had brought this bottle and they returned. And I don't think it was just Henry that received it, but I think all the children, because it said it was talking about how it kept dwindling down. Now, one thing I had confusion about as I was going through, because, you know, I was taking a genealogical perspective. So I'm going through documents and newspapers and census records, and I got confused pretty quick. And one of those things that happens when you get confused, you want to research it more. So Dorothy came up a couple of times as a ward, and I was confused because I was like, well, I know Dorothy was born to Harriet, so I don't understand the language. And since I'm not from a legal background, it took me a while to wrap my head around it. So they put out these legal notices all the time in the newspapers, whether it was for land or wills or other legal notices. And this was a citation about the wardship, the guardianship of Dorothy F. Newell. And the language is strong of the time period. And it says to Dorothy F. Citation, the state of New Hampshire, Rockingham, Court of Probate, to Dorothy F. Newell of Derry and in said county, mentally incompetent ward, her heirs, expectant, and all other persons interested. Whereas Harriet Chase Newell, guardian for said ward, has filed the first account of her said guardianship in the probate office for said county. And then I also saw in the 1930 census that Dorothy Newell was listed as a ward within the house of Mary Collins. So I was confused at first, but I went back to, in retrospect, and Harriet explains that Dorothy had meningitis when she was very young. And so it had made her mentally disabled. And so she wasn't in institutions from the very beginning. It said she was institutionalized, and she was later, but it sounds like, and it seems like from the paperwork, that she was within houses of smaller families where she was the ward in those houses, and then later went into an institution. So when you come across that kind of thing as you're going through materials, dig a little deeper and try to understand what's going on there. And apparently Harriet visited her. She said she visited her regularly. Later on, she recognized who she was until late in life, I believe. Now, Harriet does talk about how she feels like she was very resilient, and a good night's sleep could make her feel much better about life. But of course, there are times in anyone's life where it's just hard and it can be really devastating. And there were two particular ones that were listed among others, but I thought we'd look at some probate because it's interesting stuff. Harriet lost both of her parents in the year 1912. That's a lot to handle. And then her husband, Charles, in 1924. So she had the 7 children on her own. But let's just look at the will of Benjamin Chase for a minute. I really enjoy this. One, because I like the language of wills, and 2, because it gives you different associates, right? You start to say, okay, is this the right Benjamin Chase? Do I see Harriet listed? Do I know it's who I'm looking for? It's all those fun little clues, and wills talk a lot, so you get all those good clues and associations. So what does Benjamin say? I'll see if I can get it in a little bit closer. I, Benjamin Chase of Derry in the county of Rockingham and state of New Hampshire, being of a sound and disposing mind and memory, but knowing the uncertainty of human life, do hereby make and declare this to be my last will and testament, hereby revoking any and all wills heretofore made by me. First, I desire and direct that my executrix, hereinafter named, pay all my just debts and funeral expenses. Second, I give and bequeath to my beloved daughter, Harriett Chase Newell, all of my estate, both real and personal, of which I may die possessed. So we know that Harriet did receive all of the land or the personal estate. And so that was, even though it was a devastating year, that would have been helpful to her in many ways. And then we have the will of Charles Newell. And Charles is so educated, so his will is long. I'm not gonna read the entire thing to you. He gave to many different places around town, the Masonic Association, the House of Mercy. And then he had these stipulations for the children. And I laughed out loud at the reference desk, and I hope you take no offense. I was brought up Catholic, so please take no offense, but he has a stipulation: the children may receive money. They may receive money under the express condition that said child shall not have become a Catholic or engaged or married to a Catholic, in which latter event said trustee shall pay such child the sum of $100 only, and the balance of such child's share shall remain in the principal of said trust. So he said, the children will have this much money and that will be helpful to them. But if they happen to become a Catholic or they marry a Catholic, forget about it. So, he had a certain, standard, and he stuck to it. And that made me laugh, even though maybe it's upsetting to some people. I apologize, but I just thought it was very forceful, and he knew what he was doing. All right, church and community. As I mentioned, obviously, we know that Harriet wrote the Central Congregational Church book. She obviously was very closely associated with the church. She was a dedicated member and president of the Ladies Benevolent Society more than once. And when I was talking to Rick earlier today, he was saying she really was a tie to the past for the church, just understanding its history and knowing it. And of course, when she passed away, that link goes away, but actually because she left the books, it is still there. But I also put on this, and you can check this book out, or you can't check this book out. You can come and look at it in the New Hampshire Room. This church is right next to the house on Crescent Street, so it's worth looking at. And then here, I don't know the exact purpose of this outfit. But I do know, and I read about it in retrospect, and I saw some notices about it in the newspaper as well, that Harriet would dress up in all sorts of historical costumes to do auctioneering for the Ladies Benevolent Society as well as the Derry Women's Club. And so Rick sent this on and I was like, I think that might be what this is for, but because it looked similar to the ones within her book. But if I may be wrong on that, she might be dressed up for something else, but she did auctioneer. She was out there auctioneering for different clubs and raising money, which was fascinating. Harriet was just a person about town. She was involved in a lot of different things before and after she got married. And she often just popped up as being just a really reliable person. So you can see, whoops, go back in. I'm gonna click into these real quick so you can just take a look. Members of the Molly Reed chapter and several invited guests enjoyed a pleasant afternoon at the home of Mrs. Harriet P. Mack. And it says here, regent of DAR was Mrs. Harriet Chase. So she was the regent for, I think, many times. I think she was heavily involved with the DAR. I just thought this next one was funny because it just said lost, probably on Broadway on the afternoon of Friday, November 13, an endorsed check. Finder returned to Mrs. Harriet Chase Newell, Derry Village for reward. You know, the old newspapers sometimes served as almost like our social media. If you're missing something or you wanted to put up a quick notice, it would go into the newspaper. This one was fascinating to me. F.M. Eaton, the blind man who receives chairs, is in Derry Village attending to the wants of his customers. He asks his friends to notify Mrs. Harriet Chase Newell or Mrs. Sweat if they have such work to do. So I'm assuming that they would play a liaison between the customer and Mr. Eaton, F.M. Eaton, let them know that, you know, someone was looking for work on the chairs. And then also there was a notice of holiday preparation. So Miss Annie F. Petit and Miss Harriet Chase are making preparations to open their sample room of Christmas goods in the post office block at Derry Village on November 15th, 16th, and 17th. They will have a fine line of holiday novelties and will be able to take orders for goods as their customers may desire. So she had a little shop going on too, and that was fascinating. So you can see, you know, Harriet was doing a lot in town, but it was in her later years that she started to write everything down. And it's like after she was 60 or so, those were like, that was the big chapter, it seemed like. During that time, she got Citizen of the Year Award in 1966. And as I understand, she had heard about the award that day. And unfortunately, she wasn't able to go and accept the award because she was under the weather. So Ruth Lee went in her stead and accepted the award on her behalf. And in this picture here, this in retrospect picture, you can see she's sitting there and she's actually holding in her lap a book that her grandfather wrote on the history of Chester. And as I mentioned before, he was, whenever he showed up in the Derry News, it was with that book. He was a writer, a historian, and that was what he was known for. And it's no wonder that Harriet also had a gift for words and writing down history and cherishing history. You know, that must have come down the line there. So there's tons in the article. This was actually an article that you're seeing here was written in 1968, 2 years after she won Citizen of the Year. And it's the title of the article was Derry Citizen of the Year 87 isn't about to let up. And it just talks more about what she's doing. And I thought this one was really fun because it does give you a little insight onto what other things she had going on. And, you know, she did inherit a lot of money. And one thing I didn't point out on the census was that she had 2 people who were just working in the household as well. So at first blush, it's like, okay, she's quite privileged. Harriet has a lot of privilege here, but she never wandered around like, you know, the diva of Derry. It wasn't like that. She was always charitable and always doing something for someone. It seemed very down to earth. From this distance, she seemed very down to earth. So here's a little bit of an example in case you think I'm lying about that. But it said she would gather newspapers and magazines. They pile up in her garage until there's a sufficient amount to be worth selling for the benefit of the Ladies Benevolent Society of the Central Congregational Church, or for another worthy cause. Old clothes are brought to her for distribution to charity or for rummage sales to swell the treasury of the LBS or other societies. These are meticulously mended and cleaned before being placed on sale. And then it also says many people collect and save their household grease to bring to her to make soap. How many times she must have said, please put the grease in a can, not a glass jar or paper carton. This is rendered into homemade soap in batches of 18 pounds each. Mrs. Newell has been taking soap for 20 years or making soap for 20 years or more and feels she probably has made more than 6 tons. 200 pounds of soap are made and packaged each year for the hospital established by Dr. Albert Schweitzer in Africa. And then it talks about how great Aunt Harriet's soap is. And it talks a little bit more about different committees she has worked on. She was chairman of the cancer committee, and she would collect soft white cloth to make pads and bandages. So she was always helping out, but this one line particularly struck me. It said, Harriet Newell has always found life to be great fun. And I think that did sum up, at least very interesting, right? She was always interested in something. It says she advises anyone who plans to call her to do it before or after 9, because she is not one to sit around home a great deal. So it goes on to talk more about her and how amazing she was, as I've told you. But the fact that she's making soaps, collecting newspapers, she's helping out everywhere she can. And Rick Homestead, one of his jobs when he was a boy was to collect the soaps and bring them to Aunt Harriet. And he said he had a list. And so he couldn't say Mrs. Newell. And so she said, just call me Aunt Harriet. He called her Aunt Harriet. So I thought that was great. She wrote books. This was in the 50s and 60s. These are the books you can refer to if you're talking about or if you want to find out about your own house. It also talks about Derry institutions, big buildings, a little bit. And you might find stuff that's helpful for genealogy as well, because she does have anecdotes. It's not all about, the architecture. This is about the houses and the people who lived in the houses, which I think is what makes it particularly interesting. So definitely take a look at those. Those happened from the 50s to the 60s. So again, this is a later chapter, and she's writing these books. She's putting everything down. And then in the 70s, and I found this in the lateral file, I didn't realize it was something she had done before, but she in the 70s wrote an article for the Derry News called Highlights of a Busy Life. And she would just talk about her memories. And so I'm not going to read, all of it to you, but there were some cute little ones I wanted to pull out over here. There's one, this whole one is encounters with animals. So she's talking about animals the whole way through. And if you want to go into the Derry News, just look up encounter or highlights of a busy life in quotation marks, and you'll find it. But one of the earliest recollections is of an evening at Grandpa's in Auburn. Of course, I had on a hat. A hat was about as important an article of wearing apparel as a dress. This hat was fussed up with ribbons and bows, and in the dusk, a bat swooped by and got involved with my hat. I was scared, but not mute by any means. I screamed until some adult disentangled the unwelcome visitor. In later years, I have had a bat get into the house and fly madly around, back and forth. A bat has a built-in sonar, I have been told, so never bumps his head. But hopefully for me, he finally finds an open door and disappears. And then this one, I was like, oh my God, no, please. This is like my worst nightmare. When some of the girls slept out in a tent in the backyard, some of us girls slept out in a tent in the backyard, we occasionally saw a friendly skunk in back of the tent in the forenoon. Of course. We finally discovered that he was breakfasting on the discarded melon rinds from our breakfast. And so long as we did not scare him, we were safe. But I realize now what a chance we took. No kidding. I would not have been part of that. So she contributed those articles to the Derry News. She talked about trees. She talked about wildlife. She talked about everything. It's pretty fun. And it's not necessarily stuff you see in her memoir. It's just these fun, small, minute anecdotes that are really a treasure. Sadly, of course, I hate coming to this part, which is maybe why I've left it so slim. Harriet Chase Newell passed away on 16th of May, 1976. And of course, there was coverage in the newspaper. Ernst Mitchen wrote a couple things I noticed about Harriet. Her name kept popping up. So I'm sure she was another of her memoirists. So it just talks about what we've already gone over. Familiar face on Broadway, someone who was always on fundraising projects and who left us a lot of history. And I always talk about, sometimes there's those treasures you find. And I found when I was looking for stuff on Elsie Yaskin, I also saw Harriet Chase Newell, go figure. And she's got a story in this New Hampshire Folktales book. These were compiled in the 30s, and they were they were stories. They're oral, oral histories from the Women's League. Okay, I'm sorry, my light has gone out, so I just wanna. So I can read you a little bit. So yeah, the Women's League, they'd have people write down memories that they had, women write down memories that they had. And so, you might not necessarily think to look for Harriet Chase Newell in a compendium of short stories, but lo and behold, there she is in the Scotch-Irish Tales component. So, Derry has Scotch-Irish history, and when you look at a lot of the stories from the Derry Women's Club, you find them in the Scotch-Irish Tales portion. So if you'll indulge me for just a second, I'll read you the short story that she has here about Dr. Brown. And yeah, it's just in her words. So it's another fun one to hear. Dr. Sylvanus Brown was a very eccentric character, but a man who did a great deal of good among the poor and left a bequest to the town of Derry. He lived in 4 different houses at various times, all of them near the junction of the turnpike and the so-called Rochester Railroad. He would go out of his way to avoid passing the houses of people he did not like, always leaving the house at his left, and the same with the church. Although he had a license to preach, he seemed to delight in tormenting the ministers. If he could get the chance, he would go into pulpits uninvited and preach a sermon. Once he left a pack of cards in the pulpit. When a certain church was remodeled, he insisted that he would preach the first sermon in that church and climbed the ridgepole and carried out his intentions from that height. Mr. Horace B. Johnson of Windham tells of Dr. Brown calling at the home of Mr. Johnson's uncle, where he stayed so long in the absence of the uncle that Mr. Johnson invited him to sit down to supper, but he refused, saying that he wouldn't eat so long as his host was not there. The family ate, however, and at 9 o'clock, the man of the house returned. His wife put supper on the table for him, and again, Dr. Brown was invited to seat himself at the table, which he now did. Mr. Johnson says that the item about the supper which impressed him the most was the fact that his aunt made 17 cups of tea for the doctor. Finally, he lay down on the sofa in the sitting room and said he would spend the night, as it was then about midnight. The family retired, but that found the next morning that he had left sometime during the night. When he started out to drive to Salisbury, Massachusetts, he would take along with him a cheese box full of food and 2 gallons of cider for lunch on the way. His horse he called Blessed Charlie. One time, some mischievous boys trimmed the hair all of the horse's tail, saying no horse should go without a tail. Dr. Brown would not take the animal out of the barn until he had arranged an artificial tail, which he fastened onto the crupper so cleverly that the substitute was hardly noticeable. And she goes on about Sylvanus Brown. Just a funny, strange little anecdote. So, sometimes you find traces of people in the strangest of places. And I wouldn't know that Harriet was in there unless I had seen her when I saw Elsie Gaskin. So that's all I have on Harriet. There's certainly